This video is just going to run through your inquiry task and the requirements of the task itself. So yesterday we had this brief introduction to threats to democracy. We were introduced to these questions which really can be thought of as the foundation to a strong democracy. If these questions can be answered reasonably well, it means that democracy is thriving and can be sustained for a long period of time. Your task is to research one of the following threats to Australian democracy specifically, and to evaluate how important that threat is to the stability of our government. Now, obviously, our term evaluate here means that you need to make a judgment or provide a conclusion as to whether one of these 5 threats is actually going to completely erode democracy in Australia. So the 5 different threats we've got here: organised crime, misinformation, corruption, media bias, and the influence of vested interests, so interests of lobby groups in state capture. In your research, so you can present this in a note-taking table, you can present it in a mind map, it's up to you how you want to present your information, but you should include a description of what the threat is, your chosen threat, an explanation of how the threat is relevant to Australia, a judgment of how potentially damaging the threat is to society, which is directly related to the evaluation that you have to complete, and finally a suggestion of how the threat can be fixed, either a strategy or a government policy that can be implemented. Now you can see what I've done is I've actually linked each of these points to a different part of your validation, which will be an in-class essay. So a description of what your threat is could serve as an introduction. How it's relevant to Australia could be your first main body paragraph. Your judgment, your evaluation could be your second main body paragraph. And your suggestion can be the final main body paragraph. So your in-class validation will be in the form of an essay to answer the question: evaluate one threat to Australian democracy and suggest a strategy for that threat to be diminished. So by doing these 4 things in your research, you should be able to provide a pretty comprehensive, pretty coherent answer to that essay question. There are a couple of resources in this task sheet to help you. I've done an example inquiry, which we'll run through. I'll show you the marking key for the task itself. There's a list of general research questions to help you get started for each threat, and also there's a list of potential resources that you can use for your threats as well. Just looking here, and this is where I suggest you get started. For each of the 5 threats, I've included 5 questions to help you get started, and I've also included a few resources that you can use to help get your research started. Now, here's a couple of things to do with the actual research component. Your research table or your notes, however you want to do it, can contain no more than 10 inquiry questions, which means that the questions you include need to be really open-ended in nature, and they need to provide you with an avenue to get a lot of detailed research for one question. What I don't necessarily want is, a question of, what is the definition of organised crime, and having a couple of sentences for each question, because I feel that is a little bit of a waste of time. And now that you're in year 10, you can move on to something a little bit more detailed, something a little bit more comprehensive. So no more than 10 research questions. Each of those research questions, needs to count for something at the end of your inquiry. Your bibliography referencing also needs to have 10 sources, 8 of which cannot be from below. So you can use 2 of the resources from below, but you need to find 8 of your own. And so if you're using 10 questions, have at least 1 reference for each of those 10 questions. I think that's a pretty easy way to divvy up that referencing. So I've done a sample inquiry here, looking at representation in Parliament. So I've asked, is the will of the electorate being reflected in parliamentary representation? What I've done is I've asked a few questions. So I've included, what is the demographic breakdown of members of Parliament? And I've left that quite open-ended, so I can include quite a lot of information in there as well. And I've included, a picture, an infographic, which might actually help me, give more detail without actually writing a lot of information. The other thing I've done this in landscape. I've made sure the content part of my research table is the widest column. And I've made sure the reference column is nice and short. What I don't want is to have like this massive column for references where you include an entire URL. And so then your research table goes over 20 pages. That just wastes paper, but also wastes my time having to flick through an entire 20-page booklet. So please make sure that you're being conscious of that when you are creating your table. So I've only included a couple of questions in here, obviously. You can use up to 10. You can use as many infographics as you like, but the other thing I don't want you to do is I don't want you to be writing paragraphs in your research notes. You can bring your research notes in for the in-class essay. But if it looks like you've essentially just written your essay in your notes, I'll disqualify the notes from you and you'll have to write your essay closed book. Last thing that's included in here is an example of what an APA reference list might look like. You don't have to in-text reference, but you do need to APA reference. You need to make sure that all the characteristics of APA are included. You need to make sure that your reference list is in alphabetical order, and you also need to make sure that there's a hanging indent for your references. If you're unsure of how to do that, please come and see me and I can help you with that. Finally, the marking key. So you can see here how everything is split up. So for your research here, there are 6 total marks, 10 marks for the content of your essay, and 4 marks for how you write the essay. So the language you use is subject-specific language you use as well, which means that overall, your essay is worth 14 marks for the assessment, and the research is worth 6 marks. I'd advise you to go through and have a look at the different criteria for each part of the marking key. Something like here, when you're providing your reasonable suggestion, you need to include practical implications. So can this actually be achieved in reality? You need to make sure that you're actually providing maybe some limitations to your suggestion as well. So that's the assessment. In today's lesson, what I would like you to do is I would like you to pick one of your 5 threats, and I'd like you to start on your research, maybe using the resources which I've outlined in the document here, going through, maybe having a look at some of the questions that you might like to answer, or having a read through some of the resources, watching a video to help pick your threat and also start on your research table. Any other questions, I'll be happy to ask in further lessons, or you can feel free to shoot me an email and I will get to that in time.